it leads to serfdom. That's the road to serfdom. The other philosophy is just the opposite. Karl Polanyi, who is my favorite author, at the end of the Second World War published one of the most influential books of the 20th century, The Great Transformation. And in the last chapter of this book, he has a shocking and surprising sentence: maintaining regulation makes us free. And I often ask my students when they read this book, what does it mean? Regulation makes us free. I have to say I don't get always perfect answer to this question. Then I have a very banal example. Think about traffic regulations. Of course, you cannot do what you want to do. You cannot speed with 120 miles. You cannot turn where you want to turn. You have to follow certain rules. Is it paralyzing? Is it bad? No, it makes you free, because otherwise would be a total chaos, and you could not really drive any longer. So I think regulations are the most important issues, since, as we have heard before, partly deregulations, since the 70s, deregulations are the main cause of this crisis. So the banks must have a certain reserve capital, not to be so fragile immediately if people, if there is no cash at hand. And certain rules has to be followed. This kind of regulatory measures could create a much riskless economy. And I think we have to give up this, as I mentioned, casino type of high-risk profit orientation for a solid profit orientation with a certain safety net behind. And let me mention the other major weapon, which is the so-called, it's a very jargon title, counter-cyclical policy. Now, according to most economists, this idea was invented by John Maynard Keynes in the 30s, counter-cyclical policy to work against the pulsation, the fluctuation of the economy. What does it mean? Sweden, for example, for decades, since the Great Depression probably, have regulations that every corporate unit, every company, has to pay a certain amount every year during prosperity, and it doesn't go to the budget, it goes to a special fund. And when depression or recession is coming, then the state can give it back to the company, so it's no bailout from taxpayers' money, but from the same company's money, what they paid. So that is one measure of counter-cyclical policy. But in how reasonable it is so clear, but that it was not invented by Keynes, actually. It was invented by the Bible. So I can imagine that probably Governor Perry can accept that. So everybody remembers the famous Joseph story from the Old Testament, when Joseph explains the unique dream of the Pharaoh about the 7 fat cows, which was coming from the Nile, and followed by 7 skinny one who ate the fat one. And Joseph forecasted, unlike our economists in the recent decades, that there is a cycle, mostly climatic that time, and we will have 7 fat years and followed by 7 lean years. And Joseph, and he based his career on this advice to the Pharaoh that in the fat 7 years, you have to put 20% tax for every harvest. Everybody has to pay this 20%, and when the lean years will come, we can distribute the food among the people and no one will starve. So counter-cyclical policy was invented because it's reasonable, but not for every parties, not for every economist, and therefore I think the key element to solve the problem is in our country at the moment is first of all a political one, to create the political will to use this weaponry we have at hand and go out from the crisis and prevent another crisis. Thank you.
Go ahead, Bob.
Okay. To speak to the question of what is to be done about the crisis, we obviously have to pose a further clarifying question, that of agency. That is, what is to be done by whom and for whom? Unfortunately, those agents who have the wherewithal to really affect the crisis are pretty clearly making it worse by acting in their own interests. Those who have an interest in countering the crisis and transcending it and making things better for the 99%, so to speak, are so far without the capacity to affect very much. The great banks, which were of course bailed out to the tune of $12 trillion, are not as a result expressing their apologies for getting us into this mess, or their gratitude to the government and American citizens for saving them. Why are we not surprised? On the contrary, they are resisting with all their might new regulations that might limit their risky behavior in the future and hold them responsible for that. Given their extraordinary weight within the political system, not least with our leading politicians, finance is as likely as not to actually win out and keep the citizenry hostage to their bad behavior. The leading corporations are continuing with the same strategy that they've been pursuing in the US for a good while. That is, they're taking an unprecedentedly large share of total corporate output in the form of profits and leaving an unprecedentedly small share to labor. The result, as we've already noted, is to undermine demand for their own goods, leading them, as before, to refrain from doing much investing or hiring or raising wages, a long familiar vicious cycle that leads corporations to seek an even more skewed distribution of their product. To make matters worse, in most of the greatest of these companies are heavily oriented to international production and or finance. So they have no great passion for the big spending programs on infrastructure, health, and education that was for so long in the interest of and demanded by US manufacturers as they rose to the leading place in world production from, say, the 1790s through the 1950s. Just look at California. Republican politicians are, of course, demanding greater austerity, gargantuan tax breaks to the corporations and the rich, further deregulation, and more thorough destruction of the unions. This is not what's needed to deal with the economic crisis. But we can say that only if your top priority is a more dynamic economy, more employment, and better working and living standards for US working people. But that is obviously not the Republicans' priority, which can also be boiled down to preventing things from getting better to ensure that the defeat of Obama. What about the Democratic Party politicians, supposedly very different from their Republican rivals? If you took the program of the Progressive Caucus within the Democratic Party as representative of it, and the Progressive Caucus as actually fighting for their program, you might be able to make a case that the Democrats were quite different and that we might be able to see some positive change on the agenda. But as we know, the center of gravity within the Democratic Party is de facto on the party's center right, represented by people like President Obama and before him President Clinton. It is hardly radical or heretical today to note that from this perspective, what the Democrats who count, really want is something like what was put forward by Simpson-Bowles, or the president himself. The Simpson-Bowles Budget Commission, you may remember, cut the deficit, or the president himself in his grand compromise, to focus on reducing the deficit in no small part by cutting entitlements. The result of their leadership has already been a de facto reduction in spending, made much worse by the reduction in social spending taking place at the state and local level. So we're getting from the Democratic Party de facto, not in rhetoric, but de facto, a continuation not of stimulus, but a new contraction. In the run-up to the election that is starting now, Obama is likely to put forward limited measures to stimulate the economy. But we should remember that they've all been, as Obama himself has said, they've all been previously embraced by past Republican parties and will not in any case be allowed to pass by the current Republican Party. The one socio-political force that is actually devoted to Keynesian demand management, a broad program of expansion, of investment in infrastructure, education, health, and so forth, is of course organized labor, the unions. Unfortunately, the unions have managed to deprive themselves of practically any influence at all in the American polity by adopting as their chief strategy getting Democrats elected. This has sadly allowed the Democratic Party to take them for granted, and they do a fantastic job at election time for the Democrats, and thus de facto to ignore them. Since the unions are totally dependent on the Democrats really don't feel any need to bow to their needs. Where does this leave us? If you asked me this question 6 weeks ago, the answer would have had to be depressed. Very depressed. But what we've had exploding onto the scene since then is, of course, Occupation Wall Street. Occupation Wall Street. The genius of OWS has been to portray themselves as speaking for the 99%. It couldn't be more obvious that virtually every element within the establishment has made clear that it doesn't want to or is unable to act in the interest of that 99%. They've been able to get away with it to a large extent, not because we don't know what the 99% want, there's plenty of polls, but because they've basically been able to control the conversation. Yet, as I say, the actual 99% could not be clearer that they find the stasis in favor of the top 1% quite unacceptable. It turns out, for that reason, that already, in the latest polls, 57% of those polled support Occupation Wall Street across the country. In New York City, it's something like 75%. Just to close, I would say, this is not the OWS is not just making a propaganda coup, which of course they are, but they have done something quite different from previous movements coming out of similar strata, you might say. They've looked from the beginning and made it crystal clear that they look to the working class as a whole as the power base to make changes and whose interest they want to organize. In New York, this has already resulted in turning some of the hidebound unions into much more exciting organizations, and the unions have in turn tried to help build OWS. If Occupation Wall Street and the labor movement can begin to cross-fertilize with one another and drive each other upward, maybe we'll have a serious force that can offer an agency for the programs that I think the 99%, including most of the people in this room, actually want.
We need re-regulation. When the bankers lobbied for the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999, they persuaded lawmakers that if they weren't released from the restraints of New Deal legislation, they would take their capital elsewhere. Within a global economy, rules have to be international in scope. Hindsight proves that the regulations worked. Canada, for instance, did not participate in the deregulation movement of the 1980s, and they have suffered much less than other countries from our recession and the crisis we're in. While economic novelties charge ahead with the speed of the computer, political processes, slowed by the need to deliberate, be cautious, and have good judgment, have just plodded along. Still, as in the 1930s, people looked to the government to try to prevent a repeat of a crisis that they've just gone through. But unlike the 1930s, today there is no consensus about what caused this crisis, and voters have oscillated between the two political parties, leaving us with a sort of a suspended animation. One of the developments that has gone under the radar is the growth of transnationalism. And by transnationalism, I mean the layering of accords and protocols and treaties and new jurisdictions over sovereign authority. This is where hope lies. There's the Basel III Accords, which are going to improve the quality, consistency, and transparency of the capital base of banks. The G20 meeting in Korea a year ago at this time agreed to begin implementing them in 2013 and to finish by 2019. There's also the Volcker Rule, which is sort of a fascinating example in itself. The Volcker Rule would limit the proprietary investments of banks. It's a very interesting thing that I think we sometimes forget is that banks used to be partnerships. And when there were partnerships, the partners shared the risk. But once banks incorporated, they did not have the same responsibility. And this is what set them free to take all these risks. The Volcker Rule, as I said, would limit their proprietary investment. It's interesting that the Volcker Rule started out as a 3-page proposal. After intense lobbying in these last few months, it is now over 300 pages, just stacked with exceptions and qualifications. But still, it's probably better than nothing at all. As long as capitalism is going to push us to the frontiers of the possible, governments are going to be forced to react and adapt. I think the American people rely both on capitalism and government to protect their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And there have been long periods when the dynamism of the economy and the authority of the government have enhanced each other. Currently, we lack both that harmony and any sort of insight in how we might reestablish that balance. So I think it's going to take a nudge from outside our borders to solve the problems we now have.
And now the panelists are eager to hear your responses, your questions, and if you could, I think there is a mic floating, is it floating or? Okay, it will be floating, and come up and introduce yourself and raise a question.
Maybe the mic can go around because it's harder for people to sort of.
Yeah, no, it can. Okay.
It's harder for people to want to just look.
One. First one.
Great.
What do we do about the?
That's fine.
What do we do about the pay for play? It seems to me that our political system is directly related to who contributes what money to the politicians. I know in the environmental area that there was a company that was charging 17 cents a gallon for disposal of wastewater, oily water, and the major market company was able to get a new regulation passed in California about 180 days, which was a record, that that they could shift the regulations in such a way that they got their market back. It lasted for about 2 years, and then common cause, and it became obvious what had happened, and they changed the regulation back. But there is a direct consequence between people contributing to politicians and politicians passing laws and regulations according to what those contributors wanted.
I'd like to answer
Indeed,
that.
Joyce.
Well, one thing you can do is to sign the Get Money Out of Politics petition. If you just Google Get Money Out of Politics, you can find that petition. I think with the Supreme Court decisions that equate money with free speech, we're going to need a constitutional amendment to get money out of politics, and I really don't see any hope at the national level until we do that.
Let me quote Will Rogers, who many, many decades ago said that we have the best Congress money can buy, and unfortunately still true. And that's the way, so we politically had to make something to change the system, which is seemingly extremely difficult. And I'm pretty pessimistic that it may happen in the coming years, at least.
Right there.
Bruce Hector's my name. Are we going to break up the big banks? Is there any way to break up the big banks? They seem to be holding everything and not lending anything and controlling the whole game.
This is a rhetorical. I assume that was a rhetorical question.
I think it's a serious.
It's a great proposal.
Yes, I would just say, look around the world, and indeed one of the arguments that American banks always made with regard to the Glass-Steagall is, unless we combine investment and commercial, we can't compete with the big banks abroad. And I do think this global situation that Bob pointed to is a really important one about the competitive stranglehold that all banks feel themselves in, and the size and the scopes of banks. Now, again, the decision about breaking up big banks has to be done somehow globally. And I think there is new discussion now about, if we don't break up big banks, well, maybe we can alter the role of, say, the IMF or other international institution to deal with banks on a coordinated basis. But certainly, given our antitrust enforcers right now, it doesn't look bright.
Just one quick point. There was a big opportunity to break up the big banks. And that was at the time of the financial crisis, where the banks were on their knees. But at that time, we know, although there might have been some talk about taking some action to defang them, weaken them, the advisors of President Obama and Bush clearly saw that they wanted to keep this thing going. And so, like a lot of questions, I think the answers are really not very theoretical or conceptual. They're practical and questions of agency. This, of course, is one of the central implicit demands of Occupation Wall Street. Whether that will go anywhere or mean anything, it's very hard to say at this point.
I don't think we can do very much about the politics of China, but we certainly can do various things in this country. One of the things that I recently read in the NAS, it's the National Association of Scholars, was talking about the next bubble we're going to expect after the bubbles that we had with the Dutch and the bubble of the housing, which is associated with expectation that every American is entitled to have a private house, preferably in the suburbs. Now we have a new bubble is coming, and that is, according to the article in the NAS, has to do with the education bubble. Every American parent is the first thought he has is about making sure that his children and grandchildren will get a university education. Recently I saw on television a young lady, high school, was saying, university, university, university. And there is where the bubble is coming. Expectation that university education will give the person holding it some great future, which is not shown to be true. They get involved in a high loan. They get involved with getting all kinds of subjects that they take at university, mostly lawyering, secondly, business administration of all sorts, and not finding any job. So consequently, the bubble, the education bubble is a twofold. Number one, from the point of view of the parents and of the children that take all kinds of assumptions that they shouldn't. And secondly, from the university point of view, in which they have a lot of money. They have a lot of money asking for more for the education prices. Thank you. So I would like to hear your comment.
At the moment, I think, and in the coming years, our main problem is not an educational bubble, just the opposite. I think our educational system is not strong enough. Look at the the basic education, elementary education, high school education. In various international competitions, we are 37th in math. China is the first, actually. And we can compare. Sweden has a free of charge re-educational system. If you lost your job and cannot find the same area, another job, you retrain yourself for half a year, and get another one. We don't have this system. So I don't think that educational bubble is the next danger. The given danger is the weakness of our basic education. Or higher education is the best in the world, there's no question about that. But we see at our environment, UCLA, that we have real major dangers of decrease and decline. So I don't agree with that.
I have two quick questions. I hope they're quick. The first is about debt. And are there lessons from history about restructuring debt for institutions? And then also, I know about, I've heard about jubilees and so forth for forgiveness for consumer kinds of debt. So are there sort of lessons that the panelists talked about the problem of debt? What are some of the lessons about how we might deal with it? And my second question was about the lessons from China. If it's the case that they've been dealing with some of the challenges of a rapidly growing economy and integrating into a world economy, what are some of the things that are there lessons that we can learn from them, and especially around their, it's a very different political system, obviously, and I'm curious if you had some political lessons that might be learned for this country, or not. Or maybe there are things to avoid.
No, the first question was not about China. It was about restructuring debt. I think that's all of us.
That's true.
Well, one of the things about the debt, which personal debt, private debt, it's lamentable, but it's certainly related to stagnating wages. People gave themselves a wage increase through their credit cards or home equity loans. I think it also has something to do with the declining support of education. Now student loans, the debt from student loans is larger than credit card debt. That's really incredible. But one of the reasons it is so high is because of the steep increases in the cost of private education and public education. So this isn't really a solution to the debt problem, but it does mean that it has a lot to do with public policies, and it has a lot to do with what voters are willing to support. If they back off these things, people are going to fend for themselves, and credit cards were obviously an easy thing to do. Now these same people are paying off their debt, and of course that's what's keeping us from, or one of the things that's keeping us from a revival of economic activity.
Yeah. I agree. I don't think that we have to restructuring the debt. Greece definitely has, but not the United States. We can solve the problem if we increase the revenues. There are methods. The question is again the political will. If we can do that, then it will, of course, going down further in the coming years.
Briefly on China, I think I appreciate the question, and that's not a question that to date has been that commonly asked, given the aversion we have, or the assumption we have, that as advanced industrial societies, we know how to do things right. Developing countries don't in general. But it seems to me the current public finance crisis should lead us towards humility about how to structure a public finance system. One thing the Chinese do that I don't think we can do, but it's worth knowing what they do for telling us about what we don't do. There's no democracy in China, it's absolutely true, and there's all kinds of problems with political voice, and there are many ways in which Chinese negotiate and things get decided that are informal and that we don't get to see, and there certainly aren't rules about a lot of this. But one of the things that is pretty clear now is that government officials, because it's an integrated system and everyone from the local level up is part of a personnel system, all these people are evaluated. And the Chinese love to collect data. And basically, they're evaluated on their performance. Whatever the performance criteria are, they're evaluated, and their rewards, their incentives, are in broad measure aligned with what the government thinks they should be doing. So early on in the reform era, when there was a great pushing of economic growth, with complete disregard for environmental concerns, et cetera, officials were rewarded for high growth rates. Now they're rewarded for being much more mindful of the environment, and there are ways in which their performance as political officials is directly related to the criteria that they're meeting or not meeting. The second anecdote I'll give you is that about environmental regulations and the financial system. When the Chinese decided that there was too much pollution and that companies were not paying attention, they did a very simple thing. They said, we can't possibly surveil all of you. We can't do that. But we will tell you this. If we do a spot inspection and you are in violation, all your loans are going to be pulled, period. That's an incentive. So the point is, this is a system we would not want per se, but thinking about how other systems make it possible to get what people might consider more intelligent outcomes is certainly worth at least being aware of, it seems to me.
And we'll have one more question before we adjourn.
Okay. Well, I wonder if I could ask the panelists to reflect or take a somewhat deeper time perspective on the current crisis. That is to say, it seems to me most of the commentary has focused on sort of explicating recent histories from the 1980s forward, from the 1970s forward, or at most from the 1930s forward. But several of the panelists are eminent historians of a much longer sort of histories of capitalism and of economic development. And I wonder, maybe to try to end the first Alden-Berg lecture on a more optimistic note, whether the historian's deeper time perspective in this case can in any way give us a lesson or hope for something better to come. That's a desperate plea.
You mean it's back to 1789? That's nice. Well, it's certainly true that in the past, the harmony between capitalism and American democracy has been much sweeter than it is now. It's hard for me to see a lot of parallels. I see these eras as being quite distinct, though I do think that this harmony, for instance, existed through most of the 19th century until with limited government, because Americans could do most of the things they wanted to improve their well-being on their own. Great continent to settle and riches to be made, certainly independence and prosperity. Then you had industrialization, and you had a skewing again, and the harmony was gone, and you had economic powers that Americans had never seen before, and a very weak government, and that it took about 60 years to really set that right. It wasn't really until the Great Depression that you had finally a consensus that we had to have a strong government if you're going to have this strong economy. It's really interesting in comparing our present time with the 1930s that when Roosevelt was elected in 32, there were 3 subsequent congressional elections in which the Democrats got 2/3 of both houses of Congress. You can do enormous changes when you've got majorities like that. And that, of course, is one of our problems now. But I mean, harmony was then reestablished after the Second World War with the Marshall Plan reviving Western Europe, and so you had that lasting until Bob has pointed out in 1973. You have a change again. Let me just be as optimistic as I can. We can't stay in this place. Americans are too resilient. Our economy, I think, is too resilient, and I think we are waking up to the fact that it is a global universe, and we're going to need global regulation. We will get there haltingly. Maybe we can close, or I can close with Winston Churchill's words, that you can count on Americans doing the right thing after they have tried every other possible course of action.
That's a good line.
Can we leave it? Let's leave it there.
Oh, no. Okay.
Leave it to Joyce to be able, in her unique stentorian way, to offer such a judgment that allows us to depart this room with a measure of hope. Thank you, Joyce, and all of the panelists for a most stimulating hour. You've given us much to chew on and digest. And those gustatory metaphors are appropriate because we will now repair outside for a reception to which you are all invited. But before we leave, I'd like to offer just 2 final rounds of thanks. First, I would like to thank those who made this evening possible in a logistical sense, people with whom I work every day and who are as responsible as anyone here for assuring that this university continue to function as it does. I'm thinking of my friends and colleagues in the UCLA Social Sciences Development Office, Kira Bakari, Kim Morris, Brian Anderson, and Erica Tang. And my history department colleagues, Nancy Dennis and Fiona Sweeney. The final thanks, of course, go to those 2 remarkable, irrepressible, indomitable forces of nature, Jerry and Barbara, who have enabled us to be here tonight, to engage in tough-minded fashion in difficult issues, to emerge more historically informed and with a clearer sense of where we need to go. And I think we all share the belief that we have inaugurated the Alden-Berg lecture series in a most auspicious way, and I look forward to spending many subsequent afternoons and evenings together with you as we learn from the past to find the way to a better future. Thank you very much.